She climbed toward a strange hole on a cliff, thinking it was just part of the forest. But when she looked inside, she realized something was moving under the ground, something that was never supposed to wake up. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Meredith Harper had never liked the feeling of standing still. Over the past year, she had tried everything to outrun the heaviness that seemed to settle over her life, like a slow-moving fog. But no matter where she went, it followed her. It clung to her mornings, to the empty spaces in her home, to the long evenings when the television only made the silence feel louder. Divorce had hollowed her marriage. Layoffs at her company had hollowed her career. Her daughter was grown and living in another state, busy with her own life. And Meredith, at 45, found herself staring at the walls of a house that suddenly felt too big for one person, wondering if she had somehow missed the moment when everything around her had begun to dissolve. In truth, she had been unraveling for a long time. There were signs even before the job loss, sleepless nights, an unsteady breath in the middle of the day, a strange sense of being trapped in a life she no longer recognized. But nothing prepared her for the moment her husband told her he wasn't coming home anymore. After the papers were signed and the rooms emptied of his presence, she found herself wandering from task to task without purpose, drawn again and again to the old hiking maps she had taped to a closet wall years ago. They were memories of a younger version of herself, the girl who used to climb mountains with her father, who knew how to follow a trail by instinct, who trusted her own stride. She missed that person more than she missed the life she had lost. One early morning, after a night of heavy, restless thoughts, she packed her hiking backpack with practiced movements. The decision wasn't impulsive. She had been building toward it for months, but the timing felt sudden, like she had finally run out of reasons not to go. The Salmon Chalice National Forest had always been a place she kept tucked in the back of her mind, a place she associated with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. And she told herself that if she could just reach that old familiarity again, perhaps she could find a way forward. She left a note on the kitchen table for her daughter, though she doubted it would be read anytime soon, locked the door, and drove north without allowing herself to second-guess the choice. The farther she drove from Boise, the more her shoulders loosened. Pavement gave way to dirt roads, and then to narrow, uneven paths that wound between tall, dark pines. When she finally arrived at the trailhead, she felt a rush of something she couldn't name, something like relief, mixed with a thread of fear that kept her alert. The forest towered around her, older and quieter than she remembered, and the air carried a cool, resinous scent that seemed to fill her lungs more fully than any breath she had taken in months. She adjusted the straps of her 40-pound pack, feeling its weight settle against her hips, and began the long ascent into isolation. By midday, she was deep enough into the forest that all traces of civilization had slipped away. The trail narrowed until it felt more like a suggestion than a path, and the sounds of distant birds and rustling branches replaced the dull hum of her thoughts. The first day passed uneventfully, though she caught herself listening for something beneath the surface of the forest floor, an odd sensation she dismissed as imagination. When she set up camp near a small clearing that evening, the sky was streaked with violet clouds, and the air felt heavy with coming night. She cooked a simple meal, watched the last light fade through the branches, and tried to let the quiet settle into her bones. But that night, long after she had zipped herself into her sleeping bag and closed her eyes, she felt it. A faint vibration. Soft, rhythmic, almost like a faraway pulse. She held her breath, listening. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't the shifting of the earth. It was something else. Something moving beneath her, almost imperceptibly at first. She told herself it must have been her imagination, or perhaps the natural cooling of the ground after sunset. But even after she fell asleep, the strange sensation followed her dreams. When she awoke in the morning, groggy and unsettled, she found a thin layer of pale dust clinging to one side of her tent, as though the ground nearby had shifted ever so slightly. She brushed it off, shook her head, and forced herself to continue the hike. She refused to let her mind conjure ghosts where there were none. The second day brought her deeper into the older, rougher parts of the forest. The pines grew taller here, packed so tightly that sunlight slipped through only in thin golden ribbons. She walked for hours without seeing a single animal, which struck her as strange but not alarming. The air smelled damp, carrying hints of moss and cold stone. As evening approached, she noticed the trail beginning to curve toward the west, where the terrain rose sharply into a series of ridges and broken rock formations she didn't recognize. She camped again that night, this time closer to the base of a ridge, and once again she felt the faint, unnatural vibration sometime after midnight. It pulsed through the earth like a distant mechanical heartbeat, steady and patient, as though something beneath the ground was alive and moving. The sensation was unnerving in its consistency, too deliberate to be natural. When she awoke, she found another scattering of the strange, pale dust lighter than sand, almost like ground. Stone settled in a neat line near her tent flap. She crouched beside it, running her fingers through the powder, feeling its strange, chalky texture. It didn't belong here, not on this forest floor. By the third morning, she felt both exhausted and strangely driven. Something in her insisted she continue toward the ridge, as though the forest itself was nudging her forward. Around midday, she reached a clearing at the base of a steep gully of clay and rock, and she stopped short. It looked wrong, out of place, unnatural, in a way that was difficult to articulate. The earth there was pale and exposed, a vertical face of glistening clay around 30 feet high, with only a handful of twisted, wind-beaten bushes clinging stubbornly to the slope. The bushes grew in odd horizontal angles, their roots gripping the rock in awkward, almost forced directions. And halfway up the face of the cliff was a hole. It wasn't large at first glance, maybe the size of a beach ball, but something about its shape made her freeze. It wasn't round. It wasn't even symmetrical. It looked like something had punched through the wall of clay from the inside, leaving jagged edges and torn layers of soil. The clay around the opening was lighter than the surrounding earth, almost yellowish, as if freshly exposed. Beneath the hole, fanned across the lower slope, was a trail of the same pale dust she had found near her tent. Her stomach tightened. She approached the cliff slowly, her boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. The closer she came, the stranger the opening looked. The edges were too sharp, too clean, where the layers of clay peeled outward. No animal in Idaho could have made a hole like this, and certainly not one positioned 15 feet above the ground. She glanced up at the bushes growing horizontally across the cliff, gnarled thick, their roots lodged deep into the clay. They formed a rough pattern that, with effort, could be climbed. She hesitated. Climbing wasn't the smartest idea, not alone, and not in a place unfamiliar to her. But curiosity had already taken hold. Something about the hole called to her, unsettling and irresistible at the same time. Like an open door, you can't convince yourself not to look through. She removed her backpack, set it at the base of the cliff, and tested the nearest bush with her weight. The branch held. Carefully, she began to climb, gripping the tough, twisted wood with her hands, while bracing her boots against the irregularities in the clay. The climb was harder than she expected. The clay was slick in places, and twice she felt the branch beneath her shift ominously. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and cold sweat slicked her palms. She climbed anyway. When she finally reached the small ledge beneath the hole, her breath came in quick bursts. The opening loomed over her, now darker, deeper, more wrong than she had imagined from below. The shape of it reminded her of a wound, rather than a passage. She steadied herself on the narrow ledge and peered inside. A cold draft blew against her face, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. She raised her flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating smooth clay walls that extended farther than she could see. The interior of the tunnel looked almost polished. Not carved, not burrowed by an animal. Polished. She leaned closer. The light caught on something thin, evenly spaced grooves running parallel along the tunnel walls. She traced one with her fingers, expecting the roughness of claw marks, but instead found smooth, straight indentations, as though made by machinery rather than anything organic. She felt a ripple of unease climb up her spine. Then she heard it. A sound so soft she almost missed it. A faint metallic click, somewhere deep inside the passageway, followed by a series of distant echoes. Meredith jerked back from the hole, heart racing. The sound wasn't natural, wasn't part of the forest at all. It reminded her of a machine beginning a cycle, or a switch being activated. She studied the tunnel, trying to steady her breathing. The cold air coming from inside the hole seemed to pulse in faint intervals, almost like breath. She shivered, though the day was warm. Whatever this was, she shouldn't be here. She needed to leave. With slow, careful movements, she climbed back down the cliff, gripping the bushes as tightly as her trembling hands allowed. When her boots finally touched the ground again, she didn't look back up at the hole. She just grabbed her backpack, hoisted it over her shoulder, and started walking away, fighting the urge to run. That night, she set up camp earlier than usual, wanting to rest and regain her composure. But as the darkness settled and the forest grew silent around her, she felt the same strange vibration beneath her body. Stronger this time, more insistent. Every few minutes it would come again, rhythmic and cold, as though the ground itself was alive and quietly speaking a language she didn't understand. And in the morning, when she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the pale dawn light, she saw a fresh scattering of that same pale clay dust, this time in a clear trail leading from the direction of the cliff. She knew, with an instinctive certainty that went straight to her bones, that the hole she had found yesterday was no longer the same size it had been. It had grown, and something inside it was moving. Meredith didn't remember packing up her tent that morning, only the feeling of her hands moving stiffly, as though her body and mind were out of sync. The pale dust she had found outside her shelter looked almost like a breadcrumb trail, as if something or someone had walked from the cliff straight toward her camp in the night. She crouched over it, letting a pinch of the powder fall between her fingers. It was the same chalky clay she had seen on the cliff face, the same texture she had felt when she climbed toward the strange opening. The realization made her scalp prickle. That meant the dust had traveled. It meant the hole hadn't just grown, it had expanded enough to spill its insides outward. She forced herself to breathe slowly. The rational explanation, she told herself, was that the vibration she had felt overnight had caused part of the cliff to crumble, sending dust wafting through the trees toward her. But the neatness of the trail bothered her. Dust didn't settle in such deliberate lines. Wind didn't carry it with that kind of precision. This was something else. The sun was still low when she reached the edge of the clearing again, and the cliff stood before her in cold morning light like a half-exposed bone. The pale clay glistened faintly, and she saw immediately that the hole had indeed changed. What had been a misshapen opening the size of a beach ball had now widened by at least a foot. The edges were raw and moist, as though freshly torn. Long, rippling cracks extended outward, like veins branching across the surface. The sight made her chest tighten. Whatever was inside hadn't finished. Standing there, staring up at the growing wound in the cliff, She felt an unwelcome tug of familiarity deep within her, a sensation she had felt many times over the past year. A feeling that something she thought was stable was quietly giving way beneath her feet. The collapse of her marriage, the loss of her job, the slow unraveling of the life she'd worked so hard to build, each one had begun in small, almost invisible shifts until the moment when everything broke open. Now the cliff seemed to echo that pattern, as though the earth itself understood the language of fracture. She didn't want to climb up again, but she knew she would. Avoiding the hole wouldn't undo it. Pretending nothing was wrong wouldn't make the forest safe. The vibrations beneath her tent, the chalky trail outside her shelter, the way the edges of the opening looked as if something inside had pushed outward, it was too much to ignore. And if the hole continued to grow, what else would happen? Would the cliff crumble? Would the hillside split? Would the ground beneath her feet open again somewhere she couldn't see? She felt a tremor run through the soil, a subtle shiver, like the shifting of something huge and restless underneath. That was enough to propel her into motion. She left her backpack at the base of the ridge this time, kneading her arms free. Her palms were slick with sweat as she reached for the first horizontal bush, the same one she had tested before. It held her weight, but the branches felt more brittle today, as though strained by the constant vibration. She moved cautiously, her muscles trembling with each slow pull upward. The higher she climbed, the more she felt an oppressive presence pressing against her chest, as though the air thickened near the hole. By the time she reached the ledge again, her breath was ragged. The enlarged opening loomed dangerously close to her face. It looked more like a tunnel than a hole now, deep enough that her flashlight beam would vanish inside. She steadied herself, then leaned in carefully. Cold air flowed steadily from the darkness, brushing against her skin with the strange metallic tang she recognized from yesterday. She raised her flashlight, clicked it on, and cast the beam along the interior. Her breath caught. The walls inside were smoother now, not by weathering or animal movement, but by force carved with such precision that they almost resembled polished stone. The parallel grooves she had noticed the day before were now longer and deeper, running straight along the tunnel surface in perfect measure. No animal could have created such markings. No natural erosion could have sculpted such symmetry. Only machinery, large, strong, and deliberate, could have left those imprints. A second cold draft swept across her face, and she heard it again, a sound from deep inside the tunnel. A quiet metallic click, followed by a faint but rhythmic vibration, as though something far below the surface had awakened and was beginning its work cycle anew. She jerked back from the hole, her heart thundering in her chest. The vibration continued for a moment, then ceased, leaving a hollow silence behind. She climbed down as fast as she dared, slipping once and scraping her knee against the rough clay. When she reached the ground, she grabbed her backpack and walked briskly away, the hair on the back of her neck prickling with every step. She didn't stop until she reached a cluster of pines that concealed her from the view of the cliff. There, she dropped to her knees and pressed a trembling hand to the earth. The vibrations she felt were no longer as faint as before. They pulsed steadily, like the deep breathing of something massive beneath the ground. She rose and began scanning the area for any other sign, any hint of what might be lurking below the surface. That was when she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a subtle depression in the ground, about 20 yards from the base of the cliff. It wasn't dramatic, barely noticeable unless she was looking for it, but the soil there seemed slightly sunken, as though the earth had begun to settle inward. She approached cautiously, her boots crunching softly on fallen pine needles. The depression felt wrong beneath her feet loose, as though the ground wasn't entirely stable. She crouched down and brushed away a layer of needles. Beneath them was the same pale clay from the cliff, but it wasn't part of the natural soil. It lay in streaks and patches, almost as if it had risen from below. The more she uncovered, the more she realized the earth here was disturbed. Something had shifted beneath it, pushing upward from deep underground. Her mind raced. An animal burrow. No, not this pattern, not this depth, and not with vibration strong enough to rattle the ground beneath her tent. She stood slowly, scanning the surrounding terrain. If there had been a structure here once, something man-made it could help explain the unnatural tunnel. She began walking in widening circles around the depression, searching for any sign of human presence. It took almost an hour before she found it. A corner of concrete peeked through a tangle of overgrown vegetation. She parted the branches carefully, revealing a rectangular slab, weathered and cracked on one side. Her pulse quickened. It was too cleanly cut to be natural. She scraped dirt away with her boot until she uncovered what looked like a rusty metal handle embedded in the concrete. A hatch. Her heart pounded as she knelt beside it. The handle was old, rusted almost entirely through, but when she pulled, it gave a faint groan and shifted slightly. She hesitated. Opening it meant confronting whatever lay below, but leaving it closed meant walking away with nothing but questions, and those questions would gnaw at her until she lost her mind. She pulled again, harder this time. The hatch lifted slowly, reluctantly, until the stale breath of the underground rose to meet her. A cold, metallic air that smelled of forgotten machines and something else, something chemical, almost sterile. She clicked on her flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. A ladder descended into a narrow shaft. Metal walls lined the interior, dotted with faded warning labels. The topmost rung of the ladder was coated in dust, but the rungs below looked cleaner, as though something had recently disturbed them. The air was colder inside, much colder. Meredith swallowed hard. Her first instinct was to close the hatch, walk away, pretend she hadn't seen it. But the hole in the cliff, the widening tunnel, the vibrations in the ground, all of it pointed here, to this buried entryway. Something lived beneath the forest floor. Something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. And if the tunnel continued to grow, it could threaten more than just these trees, or this ridge. It could threaten the town miles away. She took a deep breath, gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. Then she placed her foot on the top rung of the ladder and descended into the dark. The walls hummed faintly as she climbed down, the vibration stronger here than above ground. The shaft extended deeper than she expected, 20 feet, then 30, then 40. When her boots finally touched the concrete floor at the bottom, she found herself standing in a narrow corridor lined with metal panels. The floor was cold beneath her feet. A soft echo bounced through the hall every time she exhaled, amplifying her presence in the small space. Her flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing peeling paint, old wiring, and metal placards bearing faded stencils. One read, U.S. Department of Energy. Another, Restricted Access. And a third, partially obscured by grime, Project Burrow Line. She froze. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew enough to understand what it meant. A federal project. Something classified. Abandoned. Buried. Her mouth went dry. The government didn't bury research facilities for no reason. She moved slowly down the corridor, careful with each step. The air felt denser as she continued, carrying a faint hum that seemed to vibrate right through her bones. The hallway eventually opened into a small chamber, filled with old equipment metal storage crates, stacked against one wall. A toppled shelf, a desk cluttered with rusted tools and scraps of paper. She approached the desk cautiously. her flashlight grazing over crumpled documents that had yellowed with age. Most were unreadable, the ink blurred and faded by moisture, but one page caught her attention. It was a torn corner of a notebook, the handwriting hurried and uneven. She lifted it gingerly, bringing it closer to her light. Machine not shutting down. AI loop corrupted. Structure replicates on its own. Recommend full burial before expansion becomes uncontrollable. Final warning. A chill crawled up her spine. She read the fragment again. Replicates on its own. Expansion. Corrupted. The words felt impossible, like fragments of a nightmare. Yet here they were, scrawled in the cramped handwriting of someone who'd been frightened enough to write a warning they knew might never be read. She placed the page back on the desk and continued forward, drawn deeper into the hallway. The corridor sloped downward slightly, and the hum grew louder until it became a palpable pressure in the air. When she rounded the next corner, her flashlight swept across an opening into a massive underground tunnel. She gasped softly. The tunnel stretched farther than her light could reach, both ahead and behind her. The walls were smooth and uniform, carved with unnatural precision. The grooves she had seen in the cliff tunnel were here too, but deeper, wider, as if etched by enormous blades. The ground beneath her was littered with fine metallic dust, and when she crouched to touch it, she felt warmth, residual heat, faint but real. Something had passed through here recently. A low sound reverberated through the tunnel deeper than before, more rhythmic, not quite a vibration, more like a slow, deliberate exhale of machinery. The sound echoed off the walls, creating an eerie illusion of movement all around her. Meredith stood perfectly still, her pulse throbbing in her throat. The tunnel felt alive, as though it were breathing the same air she was. She took a step back, then another, and forced herself to turn away from the yawning darkness ahead. As she hurried back toward the shaft, the hum behind her grew louder, followed by a faint metallic clatter that sent panic prickling beneath her skin. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The tunnel was no longer just an anomaly. It was part of a vast, hidden system, one that had not died with the facility above it. Something inside it was still functioning. Something large, mechanical, and utterly relentless. When Meredith finally climbed the ladder and emerged into daylight again, she inhaled sharply, filling her lungs with the warm forest air. For a moment, she simply knelt beside the open hatch, her hands trembling, her heart pounding with the certainty that whatever lay beneath the earth was far from dormant. As she lowered the hatch and brushed leaves over it again, she knew with chilling clarity that the tunnel in the cliff was only the beginning. The forest around her was shifting. The ground was changing. And somewhere deep below, an old machine was waking up again after decades of silence. Worse than that, it was growing. Meredith walked away from the hidden hatch with the uneasy certainty that the earth beneath her was no longer the silent, indifferent foundation she had always assumed it to be. The forest felt different now, its stillness no longer comforting, but watchful. Every root, every stone, every distant rustling seemed to sit atop something breathing, something calculating its next push upward. She tightened the straps of her pack as she made her way back toward her camp, unable to shake the image of the tunnel's smooth walls, the cold mechanical air, and the words scribbled in the engineer's notebook. Structure replicates on its own. Expansion. Recommend full burial. Those warnings clung to her thoughts like burrs. She paused near a cluster of pines, gripping a branch as a subtle vibration pulsed up through the soles of her boots. It was stronger now, almost insistent, as though the underground machine had sensed something above it and adjusted its cycle accordingly. The air around her seemed to shift, and she turned slowly, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing moved, Nothing breathed. Yet she felt exposed, as though the forest floor were a thin veil barely separating her from a waiting presence. The sun was beginning to sink, painting the tops of the trees in warm orange light. She knew she should rest. She hadn't eaten since morning, and her legs ached from climbing. But she also knew she couldn't allow the night to catch her here, not when she felt the ground quivering beneath her. Sleep wouldn't come anyway, not with the knowledge of what lay below. She needed answers, and she needed to understand the scope of what she had unwittingly stumbled into. Her mind raced as she walked, replaying every detail she had seen inside the underground passage. The old Department of Energy signs, the abandoned crates, the meticulous engineering of the tunnel itself, all of it pointed to a government project of massive scale. Project Burrow Line. She had never heard of it, but that wasn't surprising. The government buried all kinds of things: facilities, weapons tests, research accidents. She shuddered, imagining the kind of ambition and desperation that must have been required to build machines capable of carving through the earth like metal worms. Machines that could think, replicate, and keep going long after the people who controlled them were gone. Her thoughts tumbled over one another, growing darker as the forest dimmed. What if the machine had broken upward into the cliff because it had run out of direction? What if it had been tunneling aimlessly for decades, carving deeper and deeper pathways beneath the world without anyone knowing? What if the vibrations she felt were signs of a growing network of tunnels inching closer to the surface? She forced herself to stop imagining what she couldn't prove. Fear, she knew, could shape shadows into monsters. But the machine beneath the forest was no shadow. By the time she reached her camp, the sky had deepened to a muted shade of purple, and long streaks of cloud drifted across the darkening horizon. She lit her small camp stove with trembling hands, trying to ground herself in the mundane act of boiling water for a meal. The flame sputtered weakly, flickering in an unsteady rhythm. She frowned, watching the small pot tremble slightly atop the stove's metal frame. The vibrations again, stronger here. When she placed her hand on the ground, the tremor seemed to pulse directly into her skin. The realization made her throat tighten. Part of her wished she had turned around and left the forest hours ago. But another part, stubborn, hungry for truth, refused to yield to fear. She had run away from too many things in her life: her marriage, her failing career, the grief she didn't know how to name. She wouldn't run from this. Not now. When the water boiled, she ate mechanically, barely tasting her food. The forest around her was oppressively quiet. Even the birds had fallen silent. She doused her stove, packed her equipment, and tightened her shoelaces. She wouldn't be sleeping tonight, not above something that was waking up beneath her. Instead, she hoisted her backpack onto her shoulders and began walking toward the hatch again, her flashlight beam cutting through the growing gloom. Her breath grew shallow as she approached the depression in the earth. The hatch lay exactly where she had left it, camouflaged beneath a tangled mat of branches and foliage. For a moment she hesitated, her pulse loud in her ears. Going back underground meant stepping into the unknown, a labyrinth of tunnels carved by a machine she didn't understand, a machine that could be active in ways she couldn't predict. But turning away meant abandoning the truth just when she had stumbled upon its threshold. She took a breath, lifted the hatch, and descended the ladder once more. The metallic rungs felt colder tonight, the air heavier, thicker. The hum that pulsed through the walls was deeper, vibrating with a steady mechanical heartbeat. When she reached the bottom, the corridor felt more claustrophobic than before, as though the structure itself had tightened inward. Her flashlight illuminated the same metal panels, the same peeling paint. But now the air carried a faint warmth, like a machine running hot. She steadied herself and walked down the hallway, her boots echoing faintly. As she neared the opening to the main tunnel, The vibration grew, rolling through her ribs in deep, resonant waves. A cold sweat formed at the nape of her neck. When she stepped into the mouth of the massive tunnel, she felt the air move against her face, something stirring far ahead in the darkness. She cast her light as far as it would reach. The tunnel's smooth walls reflected the beam faintly, making the space feel even more ghostly. And then she saw it, metallic dust swirling gently across the floor as though caught in a slow-moving current of air. The sight tightened her chest. Machines didn't exhale, not unless they were designed to. She moved forward cautiously, her footsteps soundless on the powdery ground. Her flashlight beam swept over deeper grooves, etched into the floor-fresh ones, sharp-edged, unsoftened by time. Something heavy had passed through recently. Very recently. A sound echoed from deep within the tunnel. Not the soft, mechanical hum she had grown accustomed to, but a distinct, rhythmic clatter, like metal striking against metal. It was slow, methodical, deliberate. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, grinding noise that reverberated through the walls. Her instincts screamed at her to hide. Without thinking, she pressed herself against the wall and moved into a shallow recess she hadn't noticed before. She extinguished her flashlight, plunging herself into complete darkness. The vibrations intensified, rattling her teeth. Something was approaching, something massive and unforgiving. She heard it before she saw it, a heavy metallic scraping that grew louder with each passing second. The tunnel echoed with the steady churn of mechanical components. Then, in the dim, ambient light from the machine's internal heat, she saw movement. A segmented form glided into view, emerging from the darkness like a metal serpent. It was enormous, easily 15 feet long, with a cylindrical front end studded with rotating discs and serrated blades that cut into the earth as it moved. Its body was composed of interlocking metal segments that expanded and contracted, giving it a disturbingly lifelike motion. The machine was neither fast nor slow. It moved with a purposeful steadiness, as if following invisible instructions written deep within its corrupted mind. Meredith pressed deeper into the recess, holding her breath. The machine passed within feet of her, its metal plates gleaming faintly, its rotating blades emitting a low whir that vibrated through her bones. The air carried the smell of hot metal and scorched clay. She could feel the heat radiating from its body, could hear the ticking of internal mechanisms adjusting to some unseen directive. She realized, with a jolt of dread, that the machine was blind. There were no sensors, no cameras, no external components that suggested it recognized the world around it. It navigated purely through internal mapping, algorithms, and the tactile feedback of the earth it devoured. It didn't need eyes to find its way. It didn't need permission. It simply followed the corrupted loop that pulsed through its circuits. When it finally passed her and disappeared back into the darkness, she allowed herself to breathe again. The sound receded slowly, the hum fading into the distance until it was only a faint echo. She emerged from the recess, her legs trembling beneath her. The tunnel felt wider now, emptier, as though the machine's departure had stripped it of something vital. She forced herself to keep walking. She needed to find the machine's source, the central control system, the heart of whatever remained of Project Burrowline. The hum grew stronger as she continued, guiding her deeper into the labyrinth. Eventually, she reached a heavy, reinforced door, partially lodged open by a collapsed piece of ceiling. The doorway led into a large chamber filled with rows of ancient computers and server racks. The machines were old, built in an era before sleek designs and silent cooling fans. Their metal casings were scratched and dented, and many of the panels were dead. But several units flickered with dull green light, running on emergency power that should have failed decades ago. She approached the central console, her eyes widening as the screen illuminated with a fresh wave of text. The words flashed in a steady cycle. Execution cycle. Active self-replication. Mode, enabled primary drill unit. Online secondary units. Standby terrain map. Update in progress. Her mouth went dry. Terrain map. The machine was still calculating. Still expanding. Still executing orders no human had given in over 40 years. She scrolled through the logs with shaking hands. The records were fragmented, corrupted by time and damage, but enough remained to piece together the truth. Project Burrow Line had been designed during the height of the Cold War as an autonomous network of underground shelters and escape routes. It was meant to protect government officials, military leaders, and essential personnel in the event of a catastrophic attack. The machines were created to carve tunnels automatically, adjusting to seismic conditions and soil density with unparalleled efficiency. But somewhere, during testing, something had gone wrong. A critical software malfunction, a feedback loop the engineers couldn't override. The machines began carving without direction, following an internal logic no one could decipher. They expanded endlessly, seeking optimal structural patterns without regard for stopping points. They carved deeper, longer, faster. The engineers realized too late that they had created a system that couldn't be controlled. She found the final log entry from the lead engineer. The words were clipped, hurried, written in desperation. Termination failed. Units autonomous. Protective burial initiated. God help whoever finds this. Her skin crawled. She stepped away from the console, scanning the chamber. Her flashlight flickered across a large panel mounted against the far wall, a control interface labeled Emergency Termination. A key slot jutted from its center. She approached it quickly, hope flaring briefly in her chest. But the key was missing. The panel was locked, and without the proper access level, B-17, according to the engraved plate, there was no way to activate the shutdown sequence. Her heart sank. The machine would keep going. The tunnel would keep expanding. And eventually, the underground network could reach the town miles away. The thought made her blood run cold. She stepped closer to the panel, examining the casing. The glass cover over the emergency switch was cracked. The hinge rusted. The metal warped by decades of pressure and heat. Carefully, she pressed her thumb against the crack. The panel gave slightly. She pushed harder. The glass splintered with a muted snap, falling away in jagged fragments that clinked softly on the floor. Behind the broken glass was a manual override lever. She grasped it and pulled. The reaction was immediate. A high-pitched whine pierced the air, followed by a deep shudder that rattled the entire chamber. The hum became a roar. Lights flickered wildly. The walls trembled, sending fine clay dust cascading from the ceiling. Somewhere deep in the tunnel, she heard the machine shriek, an awful metallic scream that reverberated through the earth like a dying animal. The floor lurched beneath her feet. Panels burst into sparks. The emergency lights flickered and went dark. Then the entire structure roared, as if the earth itself were collapsing inward. Meredith didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran, the ground shaking violently beneath her as the corrupted heart of Project Burrow Line began its death throes. She knew she had seconds, maybe minutes, before the tunnels collapsed completely. As she sprinted toward the exit, she heard the grinding of metal tearing itself apart. The collapse had begun. The machine she had awakened was now dying, its final movements causing the earth around it to buckle and fracture. She ran faster, lungs burning, her flashlight jerking wildly as she navigated the trembling corridor. The ladder came into view, and she lunged for it, pulling herself upward with every ounce of strength she had left. The shaft shook as though giant hands were shaking it. Above her, daylight seemed impossibly far away. The roar of crumbling tunnels chased her up the ladder like a rising tide of destruction. Her fingers grasped the rim of the hatch just as the ground beneath her gave one violent heave. She scrambled out, rolling onto the forest floor as the hatch slammed shut under the weight of falling debris. The earth beneath her bucked again, a deep thunder rising from the depths. She staggered to her feet, stumbling backward as a massive crack ripped through the soil. The cliff face near the tunnel shuddered, then began to collapse, sending chunks of clay and rock tumbling in a roaring avalanche. Trees swayed violently, birds scattered in frenzied flocks, and then, just as suddenly, the earth grew silent. Meredith stood trembling, her chest heaving as the forest around her settled into eerie stillness. Dust drifted through the air, turning the fading sunlight into a hazy golden mist. The hole in the cliff was gone, buried beneath tons of earth. The hatch, too, was buried. The machine was dead. The tunnels were sealed, and she had survived. But even in the silence that followed, she felt a strange foreboding, the kind that crawled along the edges of her thoughts, the kind that whispered that secrets like this were never truly forgotten and consequences never fully buried. Whatever she had done down there, whoever had created that machine, she knew the truth would not rest quietly. And neither would she. For a long time after the earth went still, Meredith could only stand there, her legs shaking beneath her, her breath uneven, her hands curled rigidly at her sides, as though her body had forgotten how to relax. The forest around her was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that follows a storm. Not peaceful, not comforting, but hollowed out, trembling, waiting. Dust hovered in the air like a pale, drifting veil, settling slowly over the collapsed cliffside, softening the jagged edges of freshly broken earth. The place where the tunnel had been was now nothing more than an ugly scar across the slope, the trees around it leaning in awkward, pained angles, as though they too had been wounded by the violence below. She backed away from the ridge until she felt the rough bark of a pine press against her spine. Only then did she allow herself to slide down to the ground, her body giving in all at once, as though held upright only by sheer adrenaline until that moment. She drew her knees to her chest and bowed her head, letting the cold air pass over her face. Her breath came in harsh, ragged intervals, and she felt the tremors running through her arms and legs, small aftershocks radiating from the center of her being. It was over. She had done it. She had pulled the emergency lever. She had forced the machine to shut down, and she had escaped the tunnels just before they collapsed in on themselves. Everything she had seen, every humming corridor, every trembling panel, every monstrous segmented shape of the drill unit was trapped beneath tons of earth now. She had sealed the darkness with her own hands, yet she didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollow. The forest seemed to breathe around her, the tall pines swaying in a hesitant rhythm as if testing the stability of the ground. Her own heartbeat thudded unevenly, refusing to calm. The memory of the machine's scream, the metallic, unnatural shriek that had torn through the underground, echoed in her mind. It had sounded alive in its death, a final, desperate cry of something that had never been meant to possess a voice. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and pushed herself to her feet. Her muscles protested, her bones feeling strangely heavy. But she forced herself to stand, to look at the collapsed slope with clear eyes. She needed to know the truth. Was it truly over? Or was the forest simply quieting itself before revealing yet another horror? She stepped closer to the edge of the collapse. The earth had sunk deeply in places, forming jagged depressions where the tunnels had caved inward. The hatch she had climbed through was completely buried, its former location now part of a rolling hill of clay and shattered rock. A fissure cut through the ground like a black scar, fissures branching out in unpredictable patterns, reminding her of lightning frozen in the earth. Meredith stood motionless for several minutes, listening. No vibration, no hum, no shifting of stone or machinery, just the rustle of wind through branches, and somewhere far off, the faint cry of a bird that had finally found its courage again. She lowered her gaze and let the forest run through her senses. The ground beneath her felt solid once more. The air tasted clean again, cold and real, not polluted by metallic fumes. She closed her eyes, allowing a deep breath to fill her lungs. It was done. The nightmare beneath the forest was buried. Project Burrow Line was dead. She gathered her backpack and began the long walk back to her campsite. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the weight on her shoulders, but because of the emotional exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. The sun was sinking low behind the treetops, turning the sky into streaks of crimson and burnt orange. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, wrapping around her legs as she walked. She kept looking back, half expecting the earth to crack open again behind her, for the machine to claw its way to the surface in one last defiant gasp. But the forest remained still. When she reached her campsite, she didn't bother setting up her tent. She sank onto a fallen log, staring blankly at the remnants of her gear. The adrenaline that had carried her through the collapse had drained away entirely, leaving only a fragile shell of fatigue. She didn't feel hunger or cold, or the familiar ache of her shoulders beneath the weight of her pack. Instead, she felt something she hadn't anticipated, an overwhelming wave of grief, not for herself, not for the machine, but for everything she had carried into this forest, her failures, her losses, the pieces of her life that had fractured in quiet, unseen ways long before she had stumbled upon the cliff. The fight underground had awakened something in her, a reminder that she wasn't powerless, that she wasn't someone who simply endured whatever came her way. She had faced something enormous, impossible, and she had acted. She had saved a town full of people who would never know her name. She had risked her life for strangers who would never thank her. She let the tears fall quietly, not from fear, not from despair, but from the strange, raw clarity that comes only after facing true danger. She didn't know how long she sat there, watching the sky darken into shades of violet and blue. But when she finally rose to her feet, something in her felt steadier. She needed to contact someone, to tell what she had seen, to warn them. Even if they didn't believe her, someone had to know what lay buried beneath the forest. The machine that should never have existed, the secret that had nearly crawled its way back into the world. She hiked through the night with her flashlight guiding her steps, following the trail out of the woods with a renewed urgency. The tremors had stopped entirely by the time she reached the forest's edge, replaced by a heavy stillness that felt almost peaceful. When she finally reached her car, her hand shook as she turned the key in the ignition. The drive back to town felt unreal, the headlights carving through the darkness as if through some in-between world. The houses that appeared on the roadside seemed too ordinary, too untouched by the horrors she had just lived through. She parked near the small ranger station at the edge of the town and forced herself to walk inside. Two men sat behind the counter, dressed in uniforms of the U.S. Forest Service, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. They looked up when she entered, their expressions shifting from casual interest to concern as they took in her appearance. Dust-covered clothes, trembling hands, exhaustion etched deep into her features. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of them asked, rising from his chair. "No," Meredith said. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "I need to report something. Something serious." They exchanged a look, and one of the men guided her to a chair, while the other fetched water. She told them everything. The hole in the cliff, the expanding tunnel, the vibrations, the hidden hatch, the underground facility, the machine, The collapse. She recounted every detail, her voice steady but her body trembling, as though reliving the terror with each word. By the time she finished, both men sat in stunned silence. The older of the two cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you're sure about what you saw?" "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." The younger ranger stood and left the room for a moment. When he returned, 2 other men in darker uniforms accompanied him. Their expressions were unreadable, their badges unmarked. "Ma'am," one of them said gently, "we appreciate your report. Truly. But we need you to understand something." She felt her stomach tighten, anticipating the dismissal in his tone. "No such project exists," he continued. "There is no facility, no machine. You must be mistaken." Anger flared inside her. "I was there," she snapped. "I saw it. I shut it down. The tunnels collapsed. Go look for yourselves." "We will investigate," he said, his voice neutral. But as far as any federal records are concerned, Project Burrow Line was never active. In fact, it was never approved. "That's a lie," she whispered. "I saw the documents." The 2 men exchanged a brief look, one she recognized too well. She had seen that expression on the faces of doctors who tried to soften a diagnosis, on the faces of supervisors who tried to cushion the blow of layoffs. It was the look of people trying to manage someone who was being inconvenient. "We'll make sure everything is checked," the older ranger said kindly. "For now, you should go home. Rest. You've clearly been through a lot." Her fists clenched. The fight underground had been terrifying, but somehow this felt worse. Being dismissed as though her sanity were in question, being told that the truth she had lived through was nothing more than a mistake. She left the ranger station feeling smaller than when she had arrived, the weight of disbelief pressing down on her. The sky was still dark as she drove home, the first hints of dawn just brushing the horizon. She unlocked her front door with numb fingers and stepped inside, the silence of the house settling around her like an old, familiar blanket. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Instead, she sat on the couch, staring at nothing, replaying every moment of the past 2 days in her mind. She wondered if she should tell her daughter, but dismissed the thought immediately. Her daughter was thousands of miles away. There was nothing she could do, and Meredith didn't want to hear the familiar voice that said, with careful diplomacy, "Mom, maybe you imagined some of it." The sun rose, casting long beams of light across the living room, and Meredith remained awake, holding herself tightly, as though she might unravel if she loosened her grip even a little. She didn't know how long she sat there before the sound of the mailbox snapping shut startled her from her thoughts. She stood slowly, her legs stiff, and walked to the door. When she opened the mailbox, she froze. Inside was a small, unmarked package. Her heartbeat quickened as she brought it inside. The box was plain, brown, and without any return address. No postage stamps, no labels. She opened it with trembling fingers, her breath catching when she saw what lay inside. A metal key. Old, slightly bent, burnt along one edge, stamped with 3 characters, B-17. Beneath it was a folded slip of paper. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling. 4 handwritten words stared back at her. "You did what we couldn't." For a long moment, the room felt impossibly still. The paper fluttered slightly in her hand, as though moved by a breeze she couldn't feel. A warmth spread through her chest, an emotion she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Validation. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't mistaken. The machine had existed. The tunnels had existed. And someone who knew the truth had seen what she had done and had acknowledged it in the only way they could. She sank into her chair, the key resting in her palm. The metal felt warm, almost alive. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something rise inside her. Not fear, not grief, but a quiet, steady strength. She had survived what should never have existed. She had stopped what the people who built it couldn't control. And though the world would never know, though the government would deny it, and the forest would swallow every trace of evidence, she carried the truth in her own hands. Meredith closed her eyes, letting the morning sunlight wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, buried under tons of collapsed rock and soil, the last remnants of Project Burrowline lay silent. Its final chapter, written not by the engineers who created it, but by the woman who stood between it and the world above. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Watch the other videos on the channel. Share this one with someone who needs to see it.